so too, I think Heidegger wants to put that sort of God's eye, that aspiration to a God's eye point of view on the world, not just off the table epistemologically, but metaphysically. So you could call it a kind of methodological atheism. For purposes of philosophy, God doesn't exist. I think Heidegger thought that. That's not quite the same thing as just saying God doesn't exist, period. But for the purposes of philosophy, you can forget about God.
Welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we're very pleased to welcome Professor Taylor Carman. He earned his Ph.D. in philosophy from Stanford University and is a professor of philosophy at Barnard College at Columbia University. His primary philosophical interests are in Heidegger and Phenomenology, and his books include Heidegger's Analytic, Interpretation, Discourse, and Authenticity in Being and Time, Merleau-Ponty, now with the second edition a couple of years ago, and the Cambridge Companion to Merleau-Ponty. He's also written a variety of published articles, and feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome Professor Taylor Carman.
Thanks, great to be here.
So I think one place to start off is that a lot of people here, and I think I include myself, in their learning of philosophy have focused more on the analytic side. I don't take myself to be particularly informed on the more continental philosophers, assume taking the division to be legitimate. And even some people are quite critical of what they call continental philosophy. Could you speak sort of briefly on the divide and maybe on what we can learn or should learn from the philosophers you consider continental?
Okay. Well, it's a big question and probably mostly a sociological question, because I think that distinction between continental and analytic was at one time useful in thinking about the profession and the literatures and the traditions, you could say. But it didn't become really salient until the middle of the 20th century, and then I think since the 1970s has stopped being very explanatory. So it doesn't divide things very intelligibly. So I mean, what I'm saying, I guess, is I'm not a big fan of these labels, because I think they tend to simplify and at worst sort of polarize the profession and the discourse. So just in a couple of ways. First of all, there was something that you could call analytic philosophy going back to Russell and Moore, though it wasn't called analytic philosophy widely until the 1950s, and the term didn't even appear in print until the 30s. So when they were talking about analysis, it wasn't yet you could just say analytic philosophy. And continental philosophy, so there was such a thing that I think it made sense to call analytic philosophy, logical positivism. And then more loosely after Quine and more contemporary kinds of work, they've given up a lot of the philosophical commitments of original analytical philosophy, but it's still analytical in style. The bibliographies have a lot of the same references, and it's more of a cultural or even national sort of tradition rather than a philosophical idea. And on the continental side, so-called, it's even less unified, because that's a chunk of geography, the European continent. And there's no one thing that everybody would agree in calling continental philosophy, and especially people on the continent, because this is an American or at least Anglo-American kind of term. So there's German philosophy, there was phenomenology, there was then existentialism, which was more French than German. Then there was structuralism and post-structuralism, and so it's a big grab bag of a whole bunch of things. So if you asked someone what's philosophy, I don't think there's any kind of coherent answer you could give. What I do is sort of, loosely speaking, continental European philosophy, but it's more specifically phenomenology, existentialism, hermeneutics. I'm very interested in Foucault, but I do much less work on the French philosophy of the, say, second half of the 20th century and contemporary continental philosophy. And that's just because these are two or three or four different kinds of things.
But you're analytically trained, right?
Well, see, you can say that, but I think what you're saying when you say that is that, yeah, the department I was in as a graduate student was full of philosophy of language and philosophy of mind and philosophy of science and logic. Oh, sorry. Uh, and again, loosely speaking, analytical, and more particularly, my main mentor was Hubert Dreyfus at Berkeley, who was also somebody who tended to ignore these putative divisions between continental and analytic philosophy. So he was thinking mostly about, like me, phenomenology and Heidegger especially, but he was in dialogue with John Searle and Davidson and philosophy of science and doing what Rorty recommended wisely, I think, which is to try to ignore these sort of battle lines as much as you can and learn from whatever you can and try to ignore those categories. So yes, in a way, the answer is sure. It was a broadly analytical, but that really means Anglo-American kind of department. But it's not as if everybody in that department, um, you know, was committed to something called analytic philosophy exactly. There was an Anglo-American style, and there was a lot of logic and philosophy of language, which I was not doing, but there was a lot of philosophy of science, which I learned from, and philosophy of mind, which I learned from. But yeah, it wasn't a traditionally continental department. I was definitely in a minority there working on Heidegger. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So if the divide is more sociological and perhaps less of a sharp division than some might think, maybe the question of, well, what can we learn from those working in a more quote unquote continental tradition is maybe a bit unfair. But do you think there are some things we can say there? Maybe there's some
Oh,
themes
sure.
or issues that that are frequent that are sort of missing from quote unquote analytic
Yeah.
philosophy.
Yeah, right. So I was kind of responding to the framing of the question. But if the question is what can be learned, I can zoom in on a particular things that I work on and I'm interested in that I think philosophers in more loosely speaking analytical traditions could certainly learn from. Yeah, right. So most of my work has been on Heidegger, and it's related to, but also very different from Husserl's phenomenology. Husserl, who really founded phenomenology in the 20th century sense of that word. It has virtually nothing to do with Hegel's phenomenology. Um, Heidegger's work is related to Husserl's, but I think they're very different. And what I think philosophy has to learn from Heidegger is something in a kind of Kantian tradition, even more radical, about the limits of reason or the limits of um, thought. Uh, Philosophers are in the business of thinking and reflecting, and so they have a kind of vested interest in the aspirations of rationality and science and discovery and progress. And Heidegger's account of what it is to be a human being really puts thought and intellect and reason back in a very concrete context of ordinary life and cognition, kinds of understanding that are not rational, that don't have logical structure, that are not like scientific inquiry, and that are rooted in our ordinary skills. So our practical intelligence and our moods and our immersion in social life, these things put real limits on what we call the mind do on its own. And it even calls into question whether we're really picking out anything when we talk about the mind. A lot of philosophers just say the mind as if that's a basic concept. And if it really isn't. I mean, I think it's a very peculiar concept that has a history, and it tends to cover up the complexity of the ways in which we exercise various kinds of intelligence and skill and experience the world. So, broadly speaking, in the tradition of limits of reason, a kind of anti-rationalism and an emphasis on the way in which our minds, our understanding, our cognition is embedded in things that are non-rational but very concrete and require phenomenological description right at the outset. Um, One other way to put this sort of related point would be to say what philosophers have to learn from phenomenology is precisely that you have to get the phenomenology right in order to see what concepts like mind and reason, intelligence, and science and knowledge can actually have, what content those concepts can have, rather than taking those fairly abstract concepts just for granted.
So what does it mean to get the phenomenology right?
Well, it means to pay attention to the way we actually use words, and that's what Heidegger has in common with the Oxford philosophers of the 50s and especially the later Wittgenstein, for example. But it's not just the words we use when we say somebody knows or understands or can do something, or the way we talk about agents and subjects and so on. But also look at the way in which our intelligence is exercised in ordinary tasks. So Heidegger makes a big deal about what you know when you know how to tie your shoes or walk into a room or famously wield a hammer and hammer in nails. You know something there. And if you pay attention to cases like that, this is what I mean by getting the phenomenology right. Pay attention to what those kinds of exercises of intelligence really amount to. Maybe you'll be disabused of some of the more favored abstractions of traditional philosophy, like S knows that P, and suppose that that's justified true belief, and then we have to talk about what a belief is and justification, and those concepts they do a job, but they're very high level, and they tend to obscure the variety of different ways of exercising intelligence. So, and to see how all of our intelligence is embedded in moods, it's something I mentioned a minute ago that philosophers have famously overlooked, and I think still tend to overlook, the way in which how you understand the world is embedded in the way things show up as mattering and not mattering, and important or threatening or promising. These are all kinds of horizons of the experience that contextualize knowledge and inquiry. And again, philosophers have just tended to be very abstract and not paying attention to these concrete details.
Yeah, that seems fair enough. Like you might get the sense from a fair amount of like the more analytic philosophy that, well, humans are just some sort of rational agent, and you think about them very abstractly, but that can be at the expense of thinking about the actual experiences that people have and how they're embedded in the world and so on.
And it's also strangely, ironically, kind of anti-naturalistic. Descartes, sort of in a way goes back to Descartes. Descartes really thought that the mind is not part of nature. And
it's a whole separate substance, right?
A whole separate substance. And what that means is that you can ignore the body and anything peculiar to the body when you're thinking about the mind. Not many people will say they believe that anymore, but it's a feature of a lot of cognitive science, and especially artificial intelligence, that the actual biological realization of our intelligence is kind of a matter of indifference, because the thought is that, well, the cognitive states we're in are computational states, and they can be realized in principle in any sort of underlying medium, silicon chips as well as brains with neurons. And I think there's purely naturalistic or empirical reasons to think that may just not be true at all, that our kind of intelligence may be entirely idiosyncratically connected to the kinds of biological creatures we are, and it's not abstractable in that way. So that's an example of this ignoring of concrete context in favor of a fairly abstract idea about the mind. But notice that Descartes' concept of the mind was already very different, radically different from any concept of the soul that philosophers had before him. I mean, in the Aristotelian scholastic tradition and going back to antiquity, I don't think human beings, even within really well-documented history, have ever had just a single, very clearly articulated concept of the mind. And that word already, like what would be the word for that in ancient Greek, right? I mean, there's words for soul, and soul too. There's lots of different versions of that concept. So, but philosophers tend to be uncritical of their few favored concepts, which they take to be primitive or unanalyzable. And I think they would learn a lot from just taking the phenomenology seriously. When I say that, I don't mean empirical or sociological sort of investigation. I mean, like the later Wittgenstein, I think Heidegger wants to rely on the kind of phenomenology that shouldn't be controversial, that anybody can do, more or less from the armchair. It's not like empirical research. It's just like remembering what it is to know something or be able to do something. So it's still reflective, but it's Wittgenstein somewhere in the investigation says, "Don't think, look." That's a good slogan for phenomenology, and it's what he has in common with Heidegger and the phenomenology. There's another place where I can't cite chapter and verse, but he uses the word phenomenology. I think Anscombe struck it out of the manuscript when it was published. I can't remember which text it is, but I think Wittgenstein was willing to think of what he was doing as a kind of phenomenology, and I would think so too.
Interesting. So one thing somewhat related to what you've talked about, something from Heidegger that you've written on is the notion of truth as a sort of unconcealment, as opposed to, or at least in addition to, truth as correctness or correspondence. Could you sort of briefly speak on what Heidegger meant by truth as unconcealment, and how do you prefer to think about the notion now?
Good, yeah. So there's two different things Heidegger was saying, and I think it's helpful to tease them apart. One was a kind of historical claim, which is that before Plato, he thought, aletheia, the Greek word, just didn't even mean what we mean by truth, which means correctness, accuracy, getting it right in a very precise way, that kind of thing. And Plato sort of introduced this notion that the truth is the accurate, the correct, and to know the truth is to get it right. And so in the Theaetetus, he talks about false belief being like an archer whose arrow misses the target. You either miss the target or you hit the target. And you can think of the forms as the difference between looking at all these shadows in the cave and looking at the forms is when you're out in the daylight and you can see a form, you get it just like that. You snap onto it and you're on it and you get it. And so the sharp distinction between right and wrong or true and false. Now, I don't think he was right about that historical claim. And people pointed out fairly quickly that there are passages in Homer where alethes or aletheia seems to mean just what we mean, like just getting it right. But I do think on the historical side still, there's something right about what he was saying, which is that accuracy, correctness, truth in our sense, our ordinary sense, something like our ordinary sense, did become prestigious in classical thought with Plato, but also with Thucydides. Thucydides, the historian, says he just wants to get it right. And that's very different from what Herodotus was doing by sort of recycling stories and tales and legends. So I think there's a culture of correctness that emerges, and it's roughly what you could call, in a very broad sense, a kind of scientific mentality. You want to just get things right, forget what people have said, forget rumors and legends and myths, and just get it right. So that's one thing. That's a historical story, which I think he was right about in spirit, even though he wasn't necessarily right about how the Greeks used that word aletheia. There's other research that suggested that in the archaic period, before the classical age, there was a lot of use of the word aletheia, where it meant something more like visible, revealed, and so on. And the opposite was not falsity, but darkness, obscurity, forgetting, and oblivion, and things fall away into oblivion. That's the opposite of aletheia. So he may not have been completely wrong about the word either. But now, alongside the historical claim was a transcendental claim, which is that there is this thing call it unconcealment or disclosedness, which is that just things are showing up at all. And that's a condition of the possibility and the intelligibility of what we call truth as correctness, what we normally mean when we say something's true. And it's the basis for the intuition that motivates something like a correspondence idea of truth, that our beliefs or propositions, say, fit or correspond to the way the world is. It's often thought that Heidegger was rejecting or criticizing the correspondence theory of truth. And again, the correspondence or agreement theory, in German you say Übereinstimmung. That's a philosophical idea that goes back, I think, to Aristotle, but not obviously to Plato, and alive in the scholastic tradition and taken for granted until fairly recently. I don't know what the 19th century or 20th century may be. Heidegger didn't really reject that, except to say that it's a motivated but kind of useless way to think about truth. It doesn't really add to your knowledge to say truth is a kind of correspondence, because as soon as you start trying to say what it's a correspondence between one thing and another, it gets very unwieldy. He was more interested in the kind of truth that the correspondence theory is a theory of, and that's what I've been calling correctness or accuracy, just getting it right. Notice that with the Theaetetus metaphor of the arrow hitting the target, it doesn't really make any sense to say the arrow is corresponding or agreeing with the target. It just hits it or it doesn't. So it's not clear that the idea of correspondence really adds anything to the idea of accuracy or correctness. And the transcendental claim Heidegger makes, put the historical story aside for a minute, the transcendental idea is that you wouldn't even know what you were talking about when you talked about truth as correctness, let alone correspondence, unless you also had this other notion that things are there to be seen, they're showing up, they're revealed. So all kinds of things we say, but also pictures and ways we have of framing what we say and think that let you see them, that let you see how they are. That all has to be in place in order for this more specific idea of truth as correctness, say propositional truth, that a proposition is true or false. For that to even be intelligible, you need this background, other sort of idea, which is so basic it's hard to articulate, but you can see the difference when you see that somebody can say true things and be covering things up. There's a kind of sophistry or rhetoric that tends to actually obscure things, even though they're accurate and correct. And people can say things that are strictly speaking false, but that are also disclosive and revealing. So they're two different concepts, and Heidegger thinks the one was historically earlier, but he also thinks it's still and remains sort of let's see now, what's the adverb I want to say? Ontologically more fundamental.
Right. Interesting. There does remain the concern that, well, might someone just say, look, even if these, some sort of unconcealment is a necessary precondition for, truth as correctness, the fact that it's a precondition for it doesn't entail that it's a variant of the same thing or worthy of the label truth. So how do you sort of, is there a way to resolve that sort of dispute?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that's right. It's not the same concept, and I don't think Heidegger really wanted to say it was another version of the same thing, or another species of the same genus, or anything like that. Heidegger famously, in many ways, in many contexts, in many places, tends to use words. Let's see how to describe it. He tends to take a word and then he will use it to refer to the transcendental condition of what the word usually refers to. And that's just something one has to get used to as you read Heidegger. And so one of his students, Ernst Tugendhat, criticized him for this and saying, unconcealment is not truth because it doesn't have falsity as its opposite. And so he was basically saying Heidegger shouldn't call this truth. That's sort of your point. And in a seminar in 1964, I think it is, Heidegger, without naming Tugendhat, but I think it was coming from Tugendhat, basically conceded this and said, yes, what I'm talking about, unconcealment, which he thinks is still the proper understanding of some pre-Socratic uses of the word aletheia, he says, I shouldn't have called it truth. Seems to be conceding that point. So I'm not sure it was that important to him that you think of it as an ordinary concept. I mean, some people read Heidegger on truth and they think he's suggesting that we get rid of our idea of correctness or coincidence, accurate. I think he ever meant to do that. If you don't want, but it's this other thing that's maybe even more important. Said that. But I do think they're very closely related things. And in ordinary language, even when we say the truth, we sometimes mean unconcealment rather than accuracy. So.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm sort of inclined toward the view that whether it falls under the same label or under a general class that includes them both is somewhat, I mean, maybe an interesting semantic or social or historical question, but not really what matters, right? I mean, it might be a very important or relevant thing to think about, regardless how it's labeled. So I think.
Well, the interesting thing would be if they really were, like I say, two species of a genus, then I'd want to know what the genus is. I don't think it's a completely empty verbal question, but I guess I don't see much prospects for saying anything like that, because these concepts, I think, are already so basic that it's hard to imagine analyzing them as two parts of one thing, which you could define differently without appealing to either of those two concepts. I don't see how you could do that, really. But I agree with you. What we call it, maybe a verbal or semantic notion or question. Yeah.
So
I think another kind of set of examples to think about, the truth as correctness, Heidegger often just calls it Satzwahrheit, which is propositional truth. And it is propositions that philosophers have mostly been interested in, at least in modern philosophy. It doesn't show up so much in ancient philosophy, but when people talk about truth, they tend to think of the truth of a proposition as true or false. But we recognize pictures as not just accurate, but also capturing or revealing the person. So if you think about what makes a good portrait of somebody, you can take a portrait you can paint one, and there's problems about accuracy or correctness. You can think that, it's got it wrong. But even a perfectly, in one sense, accurate picture of somebody you take with a camera, it's hard to take a good portrait of somebody with a camera, even though every single picture will be, in a sense, accurate. Only some of them will capture the person and reveal who they are and show the personality. And we all know this from trying to take pictures of people. Some pictures really do it, just like some biographies really manage to capture the person. It's a separate thing from how many of the propositions in the biography are true or false, or accurate or inaccurate. You could have a completely accurate accounting of a person's life, and it could be a terrible biography because you don't feel like you know the person. And even stories that turn out to be false about people might still sort of show you who they are. So there's a kind of showing of the way things are that's different from not just the ideal of accuracy, but even the form of propositional information that's conveyed by a proposition.
Interesting. And you talk about, right, so unconcealment can happen through a variety of means, right, including art, but also those like narratives and stories and so forth.
Exactly.
So sort of a question on that. What is the relation, if any, between the truth and as correctness and truth as unconcealment? Is it that when something is unconcealing or revealing of something or a subject or whatever, it tends to cause in you or lead you to believe true things about that thing or person, or that it tends to produce in you that sort of beliefs that you would have if you knew that person, say it in the most familiar sense?
Right. No, so I wouldn't want to say either of those things exactly. It's not that you've got to get yourself some unconcealment because it'll be a good way of getting more correctness. Like it's like a condition of actually getting correct or true beliefs. What I think Heidegger meant, and what I would say, is that unconcealment is a necessary condition for our applying the concept of truth and drawing the distinction between true and false. So any distinction you want to draw between true and false presupposes that things are showing up somehow, and can show up better or worse in various ways. So, like I say, there is some close relationship between unconcealment and correctness, but it's very hard to specify exactly what it is, precisely because false beliefs can reveal the world, right? I mean, I would even say, when people didn't think that the Earth was rotating on its axis, but was motionless and at the center of the universe, that was false, but it was the way things were showing up to them that allowed them to see the world in a certain way. So I would insist that it was still disclosive, even though it's false. And like I say, fictions, fictions are actually pretty good ways. Novels are good ways to understand history. even if they're not full of true propositions. They have to be good. They can't be fantasy novels or science fiction novels exactly, but if they have a certain kind of realism, they can give you insight into an age, an epoch, a city, a culture. So it's not just that you can, it's not just that you can get more correct propositions out of unconcealment if you stick with unconcealment, because unconcealment is just a condition for truth and falsity. So one thing that I continue to think about that I don't know the best answer to, well, I've got a few ideas, but a problem is this. Why does there seem to be a slight asymmetry? It seems too weak to say, as Heidegger maybe was tempted to say when he says, okay, don't call it truth, forget it. It's just unconcealment. It's a condition of both truth and falsity. But if it's really indifferently related to truth and falsity, it looks like it's got no preference, as it were. But I think there is a kind of preference. I think there's a reason we associate the true propositions with somehow revealing the world to us. We suppose that those are the ones that really do show us how things are. And it's not easy to say what the connection is, but it's not a simple one. Like, if you attend to the unconcealment properly, you won't be misled into false beliefs or anything like that. That seems way too simple. If only it were so easy to avoid false beliefs by just attending to the way things are showing up. So it's not meant to be a kind of guide to true belief rather than false belief. But I think it's easier to see true beliefs as related to unconcealment, because here's I guess my best stab at this is to say, when you have a belief, regard it as true, but having a belief just means relating to things as they seem to you to be showing up. So there is some kind of internal relation between the concepts of correctness and unconcealment, but it's tricky.
Is that interest in necessary conditions connected to what you were calling Kantian in Heidegger?
Yeah. Right. There's a broadly Kantian, although only very broadly and kind of vaguely. But Heidegger was up to his eyebrows in Kant and Aristotle in the 1920s when he was writing Being and Time, and thought of his own project in Being and Time as a kind of maybe radicalization of Kant's project, which is a transcendental philosophy that's trying to find out the conditions for the applicability of our concepts would be a more Kantian way of putting it, but the conditions for the possibility of our understanding revealing a world to us. So, and he says more or less it's transcendental. He doesn't have too many. I think he's got one that I can name, transcendental, anything like a transcendental argument. But I think it may be, good to remember that Kant maybe didn't have all that many transcendental arguments in the strict sense. But yeah, it's a transcendental kind of project, broadly speaking. I mean, Heidegger was much more interested in and sympathetic with Kant than he was, say, to Hegel or the German idealists. So yes, it has this transcendental character.
All right, and speaking of that, we actually had a question from Freeze Peach, who was wondering what Heidegger thought of sort of the Kantian distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal realm, and does he take that to be a genuine distinction, and what is our relation, if anything, to the world independent of us?
Right, so Heidegger doesn't really have any use for that distinction, which may sound surprising after what I've said, because that's so basic to Kant's project, but it shows you how loose the analogy is between Heidegger and Kant. But yeah, he didn't embrace anything like that. Now, saying what he was rejecting by rejecting it is tricky, because people don't agree, scholars don't agree about what Kant was even saying when he distinguished between phenomena and noumena. There's competing views about it, which are very different. So, but I think on just about any reading, he doesn't have any use for that distinction. So on any interpretation, we cannot know things in themselves. To call them noumena is to say that they are intelligible. We can think them, but we can't have knowledge of them. And Heidegger doesn't have any use for that. And he doesn't have any use for the idea of a more concrete kind of world that we can't have knowledge of. So on one view, of Kant, there's a sort of doctrine of humility that Kant was saying, look, like our minds can't reach out to the real essence of things, and that's just a limit. Heidegger may have thought that, but it's not central to his project, and he doesn't want to assert it a priori as Kant does. Kant thinks it's a matter of, you can know this if you just think hard enough about it. You can see that it's impossible for us to know anything but appearances. Now, let me put that differently. I can say a little bit more about that. And first, so it's unclear how to understand Kant and Kant's distinction. So a little hard to say what Heidegger was rejecting, but he clearly was rejecting it. But here's another way to think of the difference. The distinction between appearances and things in themselves requires that you suppose that any of the ways in which things can be revealed to us in perception, and therefore for our knowledge, is appearance only, mere appearance. And behind the appearance is a reality. And Heidegger says early in Being and Time that to do phenomenology is not to regard the world as it appears to us as mere appearance, but to think of the world as phenomenal, and that means as things just showing up, and often, typically, as they are, and that's it. So he's got no room for the idea that there's a reality lurking behind the appearances, and phenomenology is only describing the appearances. He thinks that phenomenology describes phenomena, which means things appearing in the sense of showing up, right? Rather than merely appearing, rather than in their being. So that's a fundamental difference between Kant and Heidegger. I'll underline that by saying, we use the word appear, and the same is true in German, in two different ways. One is to contrast appearance with reality. And we say it appears blue, but is it really blue? Or it looks big, but is it really seems, looks, appears? These are words that contrast with how things really may be. But there's another way to use the word appear, which is also perfectly common, which is that, we were in the meeting and then the president appeared, which means he walked into the room, right? You appear at a meeting, or you appear at a concert or an event, means you show up. And so you should think of phenomenology if you want to say it deals with appearing, you should think of it as the showing up kind of appearing, rather than the showing up of something, rather than a mere seeming or looking to be a certain way, which leaves it open whether it may be that way or not. That's a way to think about the different way that Kant talked about appearances, and as opposed to what Heidegger meant by phenomena.
But can you clarify something? So at the outset, when you said, right at the beginning, when you said that you thought there was some kind of broadly Kantian sort of project that Heidegger was engaged in, I think you said about the limits of reason.
Mhm.
And I immediately thought, so that sounds like Kantian agnosticism, the idea of sort of limiting what kind of metaphysical knowledge we could have. But it sounds like that's not what you think is the idea of limitation of reason that's relevant to Kant. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So the purpose of it is not to draw a line around the limits of our knowledge in order to do, as Kant said, he was drawing the limits of knowledge in order to make room for faith, so that God, immortality of the soul, and so on would just be out of bounds. We couldn't ever know anything about them. And it leaves it open to have faith that those things are true. And that's not Heidegger's goal. So Heidegger's goal is something, it's less normative, maybe. It's more like we are finite, and everything about us is finite. Our lifespans, our capacities, and our understanding, and so our reason. So the limits of reason just falls in together with this broader project of describing us and our worlds and our existence as finite. Finitude is Heidegger's big deal in his big main concept in Being and Time. And there is a metaphysical side to this. It's not really Kantian agnosticism, as you say. It's something more like he thinks this is necessary for, and transcendentally, a kind of transcendental condition for our asking the question of what it means to be, which is his real goal in Being and Time. He's trying to aim at this question, what does it mean for anything to be? He seems to be committed to the idea that being is finite, that any understanding of being will be a finite understanding. And so it was a mistake to try to do philosophy from a kind of God's eye point of view, what God might know about the world, if we could know what God knows and understands about the world. And that's what I really had in mind when I said there's a Kantian spirit about this, because you can understand Kant's Copernican revolution as doing something similar, if not as radical, which is to say, put aside, here's where his agnosticism comes in, methodologically, put aside anything you might suppose about God's knowledge of the world, how the world shows up for God. And that may be what he meant by noumena, by the way, intelligible as grasped in the mind of God. Don't think of that as the epistemic standard for us, that we have to measure our knowledge by how close we come to that perfect standard of omniscience. Think rather about human knowledge as conditioned by sense experience, for us finite creatures. That was already a big revolutionary step because it put God off the map, irrelevant to metaphysics and to moral theory too, right? Don't think about just God commanding things, think about your own practical reason. So too, I think Heidegger wants to put that sort of God's eye, that aspiration to a God's eye point of view on the world, not just off the table epistemically or epistemologically, but metaphysically. So you could call it a kind of methodological atheism. For the purposes of philosophy, God doesn't exist. I think Heidegger thought that. That's not quite the same thing as just saying God doesn't exist, period. But for the purposes of philosophy, you can forget about God. He says in one of his lectures, I think just after Being in Time, not long after Being in Time, he says, God does not philosophize. Only a finite creature like us can do anything like philosophy or ask the question of being. So God becomes just increasingly irrelevant to the philosophical project. I'm, by the way, I always find myself referring to the later Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein's views about mathematics are kind of echo this same thought. Wittgenstein says somewhere that God doesn't know anything more about mathematics than we do, which is an interesting kind of finitist view about mathematics. It's a human capacity to think mathematically, and you should just sort of forget about what what you think God might know about mathematics. I mean, it's a provocative statement, but it's in a very, it resonates with Heidegger.
Very interesting. I think we're going to take a voice question from Timber, if you want to unmute you guys.
Hi, Dr. Carman. Thanks for doing this AMA. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I just generally wanted to get your thoughts on disputes over existence, like philosophical disputes over existence. So from what I understand, Heidegger sort of wants to carve the conceptual space of existence. He talks about different ways of being, like subsistence and existence, I think. It's been a little while. But now there are people like Peter van Inwagen who sort of advocate for a univocity of existence. Like they'll say something like, it seems like for everything that exists, we can at least say something like X exists if and only if like there exists a Y such that Y equals X. So I was wondering, like, do you think these kind of disputes are like substantive? Are they kind of talking past each other? I just want to get your thoughts there, and then maybe I can follow up.
Okay, so when you say these disputes, it sounds like you're thinking about things that are alive in contemporary, and to use a word I don't like using, but it's sometimes useful, analytical metaphysics.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, so and I do think that does, to use the word in that way, connected to metaphysics, it does pick out a certain kind of recent tradition, post-positivistic tradition. David Lewis and Australian metaphysics and technical metaphysics grounded in logic and very speculative. It's kind of an irony of history that after all the logical positivist sort of rejection of metaphysics, it's just chugging along very robustly in contemporary philosophy again. And a lot of that work, frankly, seems pre-critical, by which I mean pre-Kantian, dogmatic metaphysics. I don't know very much about it. It's a very different thing from Heidegger, so it's very hard to say how Heidegger's work sort of can feed into that tradition. The person who's best at this, better than anybody I know, is Chris McDaniel. And he really does get stuff out of Heidegger that relates to things in this more analytical metaphysical tradition, and more power to him. But it's not easy to do that. So it's really hard to relate Heidegger. So this is a general cautionary thing, and it's not much what I do, so I can't say too much about it. But Heidegger does seem to be committed to something, and this is something Chris talks about really brilliantly, like ontological pluralism. So there's different ways to be. I don't know if this is quite what you were referring to when. Well, it sounded like it when you said univocity of existence. I mean, Heidegger does, and he's not alone. I mean, Chris names a whole bunch of philosophers who he thinks are pluralists, and I'm not sure I believe all of them are. But Heidegger definitely thought that there are not just different kinds of entities. There are different ways for an entity to be. What it is to be Dasein is a fundamentally different thing than what it is to be an object with properties or a useful piece of equipment. And later in his later works, there's other kinds of things too, like a work of art, and it's not like any of those things, and so on. So he's definitely committed to that, but he's not going to have arguments for it that are going to be, I don't think, you can plug into metaphysical disputes among more analytically trained sort of philosophers. Like, I'm not sure there's any argument he gives for it. It's sort of phenomenological claim. So,
well, but I guess there's like that recent work by like Sider. Have you heard of like ontologies? Like this the idea is that when you want to write, when you look at these kind of disputes, you want to see which sort of language has as their primitive notions, the ones that best like carve the world at the joints. So like maybe we could look at. So I think what one way might be, we look at Heidegger's like kind of analysis of existence and see like, does that better are those terms like more perfectly natural, for example, than let's say taking existence to be like univocal? What do you think of that kind of approach?
My problem with it is really methodological, because see, I think the kinds of questions you're asking and the way those philosophers are framing it is very much in the spirit of constructing a theory. And when you say your language, it sounds like you're talking about an ideal language or a language suited to carving things at the joint, which means to be scientifically superior to an alternative language or ordinary language. And the aspiration is to have a theory which best explains the evidence and is most, logically coherent. And I really think that Heidegger is not in the business of constructing a theory. So I wouldn't say he has a theory of existence. And that's what I think of basic differences between phenomenology and theorizing. In phenomenology, you're trying to describe how things show up for us and how we most basically understand them. And it's always the aspiration of a theory to go beyond that, like to say whatever you think, however things are showing up to you naively, that's just a starting point. And what we want to know is what theory is best at explaining the way things really are. This is a fundamental methodological dispute. So people like Dan Dennett, when they do philosophy of mind and talk about consciousness, he's got contempt for phenomenology, because as far as he's concerned, that's just sort of reporting naive experiences before you even start sort of theorizing. So now that doesn't mean there's nothing to say, but I do think that you have to take Heidegger's pluralism as a phenomenological sort of claim about how we naively understand things to be. And it's not about constructing a language that is scientifically respectable or,
So just to briefly summarize, would you say it's more of just kind of a conceptual analysis that Heidegger is doing?
Well, I wouldn't say exactly that, but I would say it's more in the ballpark of the kinds of philosophers who said they were doing a kind of conceptual analysis. Well, I was thinking about the Oxford ordinary language philosophers were doing that. but their court of appeals was ordinary language, not an ideal science.
I
So,
see.
but the reason I wouldn't say it's exactly what Heidegger's doing is because it's not just concepts he's analyzing. Right? It's the kinds of things that our concepts are usually in the business of illuminating or revealing to us. So it's not the concept of skill. It's actual the exercise of skills. It's how people are doing when they're actually acting skillfully. That's what we want to look at and consider. So it's not just the concept. But to say conceptual analysis gets us, like I say, kind of in the ballpark, but we want to see how things show up to us in perception, in the exercise of our skills, in our activities, in our moods, when we experience an artwork, what's going on. See, when he talks about artworks in the essay, The Origin of the Work of Art, he's not analyzing a concept of art. He's giving you paradigm examples. He says, look at this Van Gogh painting, look at the Greek temple, now let's see what's going on with them, what's happening with them, and how should we describe it. And so same thing else across the board, I think. But so what's right about your suggestion is that it's descriptive. It's not meant to be theoretically ambitious. It's nothing like what we're doing in science. And again, I think this puts him very close to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein had the very same idea about philosophy. It's radically removed from what the empirical sciences are doing, are trying to do.
Okay, I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
So as a bit of a follow-up, is there, when of course Heidegger has his various notions of being and that are fundamentally distinct, is there something in virtue of which they're all worthy of being called a sort of being or sign? Like what is it that's, is there a general notion there or a category under which they fall?
Right. Very good question. So here's the textual answer is that Heidegger, being in time is supposed to be sort of a path. The analytic of Dasein is supposed to get you to posing this general question of the meaning of being, like there's one. And famously, he never finished it and decided it was a dead end and it wasn't going to work, and we didn't get there. So, but you're right that there's a reason he didn't just say, oh, these are all just completely different things and we call them all being, but that's just an ambiguity of the word. This is something, again, that Chris McDaniel refers to, and he traces this idea back, this neat little argument. There's a distinction between, I can't remember the ultimate sources, who was the first to say this, but there's an important distinction between the ambiguity of a word and different kinds of something. So a bank can be the side of a river or the place where you keep your money. That's an ambiguity of the word bank. But you can't describe that by saying there's two kinds of bank. Because when you say there's two kinds of bank, you must mean by bank either side of a river or place you put your money. And if you substitute either of those in for the word bank, when you say there's two kinds of bank, it makes nonsense of the claim. You can't say there's two kinds of sides of a river. One is the side of a river and one is the place you put your money. And you can't say there's two kinds of places to put your money. One is the side of a river and one is the place you put your money. But when you say there's two kinds of fruit, that doesn't mean the word fruit is ambiguous. It means there's two kinds of it. So you can't dissolve this pluralism into just total disunified heterogeneity and just say it's a verbal illusion that we say being for all these things. There has to be some way they hang together. Now, I think the closest Heidegger comes to suggesting, how to think of this. I gather this has a kind of Thomistic background, but I know so little about medieval philosophy. Somebody else will have to help me out with this. But there is what's called a unity of analogy. And the simple idea, I think, as simple as I can put it, is that there can be different kinds of something that are all related, but you don't understand them as falling under some single higher concept. But they're related by what was called analogy. And the famous example is with health. There's different ways for something to be healthy. Urine can be healthy, but vegetables are healthy, and a person can be healthy. And maybe a kind of exercise can be healthy. These are all healthy, but we don't mean the same thing in the different cases. Your blood is healthy. That doesn't mean you should drink it. It means it's evidence of health. and the various kinds of foods that are healthy. They're not evidence of health, but they make you healthy. And a person is healthy doesn't mean, etc. You see what I mean? So, but these are not unrelated. I mean, they're very related. They're all interconnected. But the thing is, you only understand the general concept of healthiness if you understand each of those sort of separately, and then you see that they hang together. But there's no one higher concept that you can articulate independently of those different kinds. And I think Heidegger must have thought something like that. There's just no aspiration to a higher genus or concept, but they are related. They're not just accidentally related by the ambiguity of a word.
Interesting. So it's probably, so what you're saying is it's probably best to think about it as a sort of family of related concepts, but without some more general concepts under which they fall.
Yeah, that's right. And Heidegger won't mind that at all, because like I said, he's not really doing conceptual analysis, and I think he probably thinks concepts are overrated. But yeah, there's some kind of family cluster. You can see these things interact and are interwoven with each other. And it's not that there's no generality. It's just that the generality is kind of loose, and you only get insight into it by understanding the particular things that are interrelated to each other. That's also, just to go back to the artwork case, that's what he thinks about works of art. He thinks only by seeing particular, or thinking about particular works of art, can you be in a position to say something like what is art, or to address a question like that. He has no Platonic aspiration to a single definition, or Socratic aspiration, I maybe say, or a Platonic aspiration to there's a form for art, but he thinks it's only by knowing what the paradigm cases are that you can grasp a more general, anything like a concept, or you can see why you can get a little bit more insight into what you're asking when you ask, is something a work of art? Not whether it corresponds to a definition, but like, is it anything like whatever, Homer's Iliad, or Shakespeare's plays, or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or something like that. It has to be a resemblance, some kind of resemblance.
Fair enough, yeah. Very interesting. And you mentioned also that, of course, Heidegger never got to finish his intended project, sort of that he began in Being and Time. What are some of the things that you think a completion of that project would have brought about?
I don't know. I'm not really sorry that it didn't succeed. I don't quite know what he thought he was doing. And I'm happy that he went in the direction he did, which is more in the spirit of what I was just describing, which is to say, rather than get a drum roll going, sort of anticipating an unveiling of the meaning of being, he later insisted that there were different meanings of being in different periods in history. At least in Western history, he thought of whole ages or epochs defined by a kind of shared background understanding of being. But it was different in ancient Greece and in the Christian Middle Ages and in modernity. And so there is no one meaning of being. There's a dominant way being is understood at different times in history in different ways, but they're a little bit like Kuhnian paradigms. It's not that one's right and one's wrong. They're just deeply incommensurable. Now, he didn't just give up worrying about the kinds of questions you are asking, because he did think that, and he reserved a word for this, but it's just a word. It's not a theory or even a proposition, but he's got a word for what it is for a meaning of being to be dominant in a culture or at a time in history. This happens, and he uses the word Ereignis, which means event, or as the verb, you can translate it as happens, or something happens. And so Ereignis is his word for maybe this more basic primitive thing, which is that suddenly, well, I shouldn't say suddenly, there's a meaning of being for a whole world of people. So in the ancient world, there's gods and mortals and heroes and slaves, and in the Christian Middle Ages, there's saints and sinners, and there's God and creation, and maybe heaven and hell. Completely different worlds in one way, but what's common is that there's a way things are globally understood to be. Also very different from in the modern world, which is a scientific and technological world. So there is something that holds these together. You might say, why are the ancient, medieval, and modern understandings of being, right? What makes them all understandings of that? And then he just has a word for the that, which is Ereignis, so for what it's worth. But that's not going to be very satisfying to Van Inwagen or an analytical metaphysician, because it's just a word which is a placeholder for the kind of thing that you're rightly worried about, which is what's the unity in this diversity. I hope that was answering your question. I'm not sure it did.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. So we had another voice question from a Canadian Catholic. If you want to unmute, you can ask a question.
I have several. First of all, thank you so much for coming, Dr. Carman. I'm going to ask just several for the brevity of time because I have so many. But yeah, first of all, I think this was somewhat asked, divide between Continental and analytic philosophy. My question is, why do you even believe that the divide exists? So what is it that prevents philosophers from, for example, adopting best of both sides? Or what is it that divides the place, if that makes sense? And second of all, yeah, I had another question about Heidegger. Heidegger has often been interpreted, one of the most controversial parts about Heidegger is whether he supported the National Socialist Party of Germany and whether there's anything like that in his works. Where do you fall on that issue? Do you have anything of substance to offer on that?
I have things to say about that. So let me go back to the Continental analytic thing. You were asking why I think the divide exists, and I don't really. I mean, or rather, it's a very poor way to try to structure or organize your view about the history of philosophy over the last 100 years. It doesn't even purport to describe philosophy before the 20th century, I think. I think Michael Friedman makes a good case that it really only got entrenched after Heidegger and Carnap. If you think about Husserl, was Husserl a continental philosopher? In some ways, he's got much more in common with logic and contemporary philosophy of mind than with what's called continental philosophy. Husserl has nothing in common with post-structuralist French philosophy. So I think they're very poor concepts, and they don't really organize anything very helpfully. I think it's not that I think the whole field is happily unified. I think there's national differences, like I said before, between English and American and French and German philosophy. I think there are little traditions that are very different from each other and branch off in different ways. But to just say continental analytic, I don't think is very helpful. So yeah, I think we should learn from whatever we can. Just read widely and learn, and you'll find connections. And who cares if people think one belongs to continental and one belongs to analytic philosophy? You won't always be able to do that with any things you randomly pick, but often you will. So I like that. I think, again, Rorty said something like, the best policy is to ignore the distinction and hope it goes away. And that's what he was doing. And that's what Bert Dreyfus was doing. And there's lots of other examples. Okay, so that's that. Now, Heidegger and Nazism. There's no question that he was a supporter of the Nazis in the 1930s and maybe beyond, because he never really renounced or retracted anything explicitly. After the war, he sort of denied that he had been a enthusiastic supporter, but that was just he was kind of trying to cover his backside. So the controversy isn't really whether he was an enthusiastic supporter of Hitler, because it's obvious that he was. The controversy is mostly about what relevance that might have for his philosophical work. And, we get very familiar sorts of claims that you can't separate the work from the man, which I'm always pretty skeptical about, because I think often you can separate the work from the person. I've never been really persuaded by that way of putting it, like as if it's supposed to be obvious that you can't separate the work from the person. I mean, sure you can. It depends on what the work is, right? And the particular case. Frege was a nationalistic anti-Semite, but it's not too hard to separate that from his work in logic and philosophy of language. Heidegger's a harder case, because he wanted there to be, or thought there was a connection between his Nazism and his philosophy. But I'm not convinced that he was right about that in all cases. So I think the answer has to be kind of nuanced. I don't think much in Being in Time really has any bearing one way or the other on the Nazism. There's passages late in Being in Time about what it is for a people, and he does use the word Volk, which is an ordinary German word, like in Volkswagen, a Volkswagen. The Volk is a word that the Nazis like. It's got a nationalistic sort of connotation, but it can just mean community. And Heidegger there does talk about what it is for a people to have a kind of authentic existence, in the way he's been describing an individual can have an authentic existence, by being wholeheartedly committed to something, and in virtue of that forward-looking commitment to recover what he calls a heritage, which is an interpreted history that allows you to make sense of your projecting into your future possibilities. Now that can describe something like fascism, National Socialism. I think it can also describe all kinds of other ways in which a community or a people, we the people, can recover a history in light of the way they're projecting into a future that makes them wholehearted and focused and serious about who they are, with a sense of their identity. So actually, I think the account is general enough that it's not just specifically fascistic. But the rise of Nazism in Germany was, it also falls under that. But that's just because it's a very general idea about what it is for a people to see itself as somehow with a kind of shared identity. And he does talk about the generation, so it's generational. So that's being in time. I don't think being in time, you have to look kind of hard and strain the text a bit to say that it's somehow implicitly fascistic or Nazistic. But in the 1930s, Heidegger was self-consciously trying to be the sort of philosophical spokesman for Nazism. And so in the introduction to metaphysics, he's clearly competing with the neo-Kantians to be the sort of the Nazi philosopher. And so he's deliberately introducing themes that are nationalistic into his work. But so I'm not saying there's no connection at all. It sometimes does creep up, mostly in the mid 30s. Let's see. There's a lot more to say about it. So I think it's a complicated question, and it doesn't have a simple answer, except to say that some of his philosophy, I think, has a kind of commitment to a certain sort of nationalistic mentality. But not all of it does. I know what I was going to say is, I think to understand Heidegger, you have to understand that he just wasn't a political philosopher. He doesn't have anything, not even, certainly he was no Hegel. He didn't have any real kind of social or political philosophy, and I don't think he understood politics very well. I think he was out of his depth in that arena, and from a practical point of view, was a bit of a buffoon. The Nazis themselves, when I say themselves, I mean the regime, took a look at him and thought he was way too eccentric and unreliable and couldn't be taken seriously, and I think they were right. So it's a mistake to think that he's got a kind of social or political philosophy which is tied to Nazism in the way Carl Schmitt did, who was a jurist and a legal theorist. I mean, the heart of his work is about a certain kind of legal and political idea, which was very in accord with his own commitment to National Socialism. And Heidegger's case is just different. So there's absolutely no excusing his political attitudes. And he was an anti-Semite. He was an ordinary nationalistic German anti-Semite, and everything he says that's really in those registers, just to my ear, is just stupid and uninteresting. And that's what makes it so different from the philosophy, because the philosophy is so brilliant and fascinating and deep. So, it's complicated.
Oh, thank you so much for that comprehensive answer, Dr. Carman.
Oh, I know. I do want to add one more thing. I think there's an interesting connection between Heidegger's political self-positioning and the pro-Hitler things he was saying in the 30s, and then the kind of excuse-making and covering his tracks after the war. It coincides, roughly, with his using and then dropping the word metaphysics. So when I mentioned the introduction to metaphysics, he just uses the word metaphysics from not in Being in Time so much, but after, in the 1930s, to mean philosophy. And when everything he says about metaphysics there is just what he thinks about philosophy. After the war, but starting in the late 30s, even before the war breaks out, he starts saying that he's doing what Carnap said he was doing, which is overcoming metaphysics. And that's the way people often think of Heidegger. They remember all this stuff about overcoming metaphysics. And I think he was sincere about that, and it's to be taken seriously philosophically. But there was a political reason for this too, because he could then look back and say, everything I was saying about metaphysics, like, for example, that Germany is in this privileged metaphysical position between the USSR and America, and therefore we have this special historical mission, all that nonsense. Later he could say, oh, but that's what I was saying, that's what it looks like to metaphysics, not to me. So he was trying to disavow a lot of what he said by then saying, oh no, I'm standing outside of metaphysics, I'm overcoming metaphysics. It was a way of washing his hands of a lot of the things he had said, invoking the concept of metaphysics in the 1930s. So there was a kind of polemical or sort of rhetorical shift in his use of the word metaphysics, which was not only philosophical, but also sort of a kind of political apology, a kind of self-defense of his post-war. Interesting. It's a complicated story. I'm writing about it, but it's a book that I'm writing, and it'll sort of combine the philosophy and the political story, but showing them to be two tracks that are not really connected. They're parallel tracks in a way.
Because he has that article from I think even in the 20s called "What is Metaphysics," right? And he's saying that some of his views on that have like shifted later on.
Yeah, well, right. Already, you're right. Already in 1929, that's right after Being in Time, he's using the word metaphysics to mean philosophy, and not just philosophy generally, but the philosophy he's doing. So there's no criticism of metaphysics in that essay as it was written in 1929. What's interesting is if you then look at the postscripts that he wrote to it, and then I think there's an introduction to it that he wrote, both of those in the 1940s, he's doing this interesting sort of thing where he's saying what I really meant was this, and then it turns out it's about overcoming metaphysics. But that's not really honest. Actually, if you read the actual lecture in its original form, there's no indication that he's overcoming it or criticizing it or anything. Because remember, the argument is, look, you wanna know what metaphysics is? I can't give you a definition, but I'll show it to you, and I'll show you it to you by asking the fundamental question of metaphysics: why is there something rather than nothing? And he says that's the question of metaphysics. And then he says, okay, so we all know about the something. That's what the sciences investigate. But what about the nothing? And then it turns out the nothing is revealed to us in anxiety. And what does the nothing do? It nothings, das nichts nichtet, or it noths, or whatever. And you're in the question of being. And there you are. And so he's describing his own philosophical project by putting it under the rubric of metaphysics. And it completely, unabashed about it. And that's the way he talks in the Introduction to Metaphysics, which was lectures in the 1935, 1936. And it's not until at the earliest, like 1938 or 9, and you see it in the Nietzsche lectures too. There's a big shift in the Nietzsche lectures from the earliest ones in like 36 or 7. By 1939, at the beginning of those Nietzsche lectures, he was saying Nietzsche was the last metaphysical thinker. That was not really a criticism. That was kind of a compliment. And then by 1939 or so this is as Germany is about to invade Poland, he starts saying Nietzsche couldn't understand the question of being. He got everything wrong because he was a metaphysical thinker. Metaphysics was his problem. So he's already distancing himself from metaphysics. And I think it goes hand in hand with distancing himself from the Nazis. But, like I say, none of this is meant to be exculpating because it was totally shameful, and he never really disavowed it or criticized it. And I think he was just kind of a moral disaster. So I don't say any of this to kind of defend him. It's just to draw the map accurately.
Fair enough. So one thing a lot of people find difficult with Heidegger and other writers who've written on similar things is that it's not so easy to navigate what they're saying. It's not the easiest thing to understand. It's quite difficult. It can be rewarding, but not so straightforward. And so Free's speech actually had a question just about something that Heidegger said, and wondering if you could clarify it. He says, so being as the presencing of what is present is already in itself truth, provided we think the essence of truth as the gathering that clears and shelters. Not sure from where that is, but
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a very rich sentence. There's a lot going on in it. Yeah, for sure.
Right.
So, yeah. So presencing is, I think, another word for like unconcealment, which is what he said truth was. So, yeah, I mean, at the core of this sentence, it's equating being and truth somehow. And I think that's because he does think of both of them as, again, things being disclosed or revealed or showing up in a certain way with a certain gestalt or aspect or character. Now let's see. So the presencing of what is present is already truth, and then what? Can you read it again so I can remind myself?
Yeah, it's already in itself truth, provided we think the essence of truth as the gathering that clears and shelters.
Right, provided we don't think of it as correctness or correspondence or accuracy or anything like that. So now that gathers, this is a new idea, right? Gathers, that's what he also says a thing does. So what is it? I'm just going to bring this in from outside the text you just read, but it's important because gathers and shelters. Yeah, this is a phenomenon that he sees in what he calls a thing, which is not just any old thing, but a special kind of thing, which pulls together a world and shows things as they are and lets them be the things they are. That is where you can feel at home. I think the idea of sheltering is something like a place you feel at home. So an example would be the pitcher at a family meal that, from which you pour the wine. It sort of sounds like a reference to a libation or something, but it's like a family meal. Think of, in our world, maybe more like a Thanksgiving meal, right? There's maybe the table or the, something that pulls together the event and holds it together, and there you feel sheltered, protected at home. That's truth happening. Bert Dreyfus's favorite example along those lines is a movie based on a short story by Isaac Dennison. Have you ever seen the movie Babette's Feast? Have any of you familiar with that?
No, I have not.
I've seen it.
Yeah. So it's a French chef. She's a woman who wins the lottery and then leaves France and goes to stay, I guess, in Denmark, because Isaac Dennison, I think, was Danish. And she's living in this village, and the people there are crabby and at each other's throats, and it's a horrible place. And she wins the lottery. I guess she's living there already. She wins the lottery. She's got all this money, and she spends it all putting on this fabulous feast for everybody because she's this world-class chef. I don't know if world-class, but very skilled. They don't realize that about her. And she makes this magical event happen. And it's this beautiful meal that's just like out of nowhere. It's a miracle, and it changes the whole gestalt, the whole mood of the village. And so that's a kind of event happening, which is, Heidegger would call that truth. Notice it has nothing to do with accuracy, but it's gathering and sheltering in this way, right? It pulls people together in some kind of recognition of their shared world and where they feel at home. Very unlike in Being and Time, where Heidegger says Dasein is fundamentally not at home in the world. Later on, he was actually really interested in what it would take for us to feel like we're at home in the world. So a thing can do it, a pitcher in a family meal, or elsewhere. He also says the Heidelberg Bridge. The bridge in Heidelberg pulls together the banks of the river and makes it the river that it is, and the arches in the structure echo the flight of a bird. And he's basing all this on a poem by Hölderlin, which is called Heidelberg, which is about the bridge in Heidelberg. So that's a thing that pulls together the locale, the place, and makes it the place it is, which very unlike a technological artifact, which is invisible and just efficient and that you never notice. This visibly pulls together the place and makes it the place it is. So think about Notre Dame Cathedral, or let's see, what's a good example for us? Maybe the Brooklyn Bridge, maybe Central Park. But it's also what he thinks works of art do. Works of art are things in that way too. And they let truth happen, and they pull together a people's shared sense of their world and their identity. So I mean, so that's what's going on in that sentence. I mean, in a very compact form. And so if you might ask, how am I supposed to get that out of that one sentence? And the answer is, you can't get it out of the one sentence. Of course, you have to read around a lot, and then a lot of other passages will let you know what he's saying when he says that kind of thing.
Great. So I'll move on to a different question. So in a chapter of Being in Time, Heidegger argues that death is not just some external thing that happens to happen to us, but sort of a structural dimension of existence, as you say, a kind of necessary limit or boundary constitutive of being in the world. And of course, Heidegger has this notion of being toward death, Seinsamtode. Could you sort of elaborate on this view and what it contributes to our understanding of ourselves and the meaning of our lives?
Yeah, good. Okay. Right. So, he's arguing against an idea, and it's like what you say, that like death is a kind of external sort of accident that unfortunately, like Woody Allen might say, ruins everything at the end of our lives. But there have been other philosophers like Schopenhauer, for example, who've said, look, it's just a boundary or a horizon, and therefore it's you should be fine about it. You should attain a kind of equanimity about it because you realize it's just the boundedness of your whole life, and it doesn't really destroy your life. It's just the edge, as it were. But that Schopenhauer's thought was really aiming at a kind of quasi-Buddhistic sort of equanimity that you should have about the finitude of your existence. And Heidegger's making a different point. It's more like we cannot attain any kind of contemplative or theoretical sort of detached view of our lives as a whole, because our lives are never finished as a whole for us. So from an outsider's perspective, from a third-person point of view, somebody else can see my life end, and then they can write my biography and think about my whole life from beginning to end, but I can't do that. So the relation I have to my own death is not the relation to an edge which I can just be sort of, how do I want to put it? Just that I can just observe and maybe be completely just happily reconciled to. It's an end I'm going toward, just as you said, being toward death. I'm going up to that end, but I experience it as a collapsing of my possibilities. That my possibilities are drying up or shutting down, and my life is, so it does sort of ruin everything. And you might think it comes closer to ruining everything. But so his idea is that the first person perspective we have on our own death is fundamentally different from a third person perspective that you have on somebody else's death as the sort of terminal event in their lives. That's the transition point from their being alive to their being dead. In my own case, my relation to my death is the fact that my possibilities are shutting down. And now he wants to say it's not something that just happens at the end of my life. It's always happening. So it's sort of the constant abiding finitude of my life that is my death. So here's another case in which, as we said before, he'll use a word to refer to what he thinks is the transcendental condition of the intelligibility of what the word usually refers to. So here is a good case in point. Why do I care about there being a last moment of my life? Why should I care about that? Going back to Epicurus and the Epicureans, Epicurus famously said you shouldn't worry about it because once you're dead, you won't know the difference and who cares, right? So the reason we worry about it is precisely, the reason death is such an issue is because we have this first person relation to it as the collapse of all of our possibilities. That's what makes it possible to worry about death in the way that we do. And this is not a phenomenon you ever escape. And in fact, it's not just at the end of your life, it's throughout. So a better word for it would probably be something like mortality. Your mortality is just a basic fact about your existence. It isn't a thing that happens at the last moment of your existence. And it is fundamentally connected to anxiety. That's the only way you can understand death, is by seeing it under the guise of anxiety. But what you can attain, that's instead of the theoretical contemplation of your life as a whole, you can see your existence as a whole in a different way, which is what he calls authenticity. And that means something like, I think, wholehearted, resolute, projecting into your possibilities, though they are closing down. And that there's a wholeness you get in that. You see your life clearly as a whole by being very clear about what you're living for and what your for the sake of is, what he calls your for the sake of, which is what you're living for. and what constitutes your identity or your sense of who you are. So he's really replaced a kind of theoretical ideal of like a contemplative view about my life as finite with this very engaged practical attitude about what I'm living for, what matters to me, though my possibilities and my identity are shutting down to nothing in the end. That's a very hard thing to do, and it requires a kind of courage and resoluteness that he calls authenticity. That's what's going on in that chapter. It's very rich, it's very subtle, and I'm not sure he manages to make a convincing case that we should believe all parts of it are true, but I think it's largely very compelling. It's the first chapter of the second division of Being and Time, which is, yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting stuff.
I've just been teaching it in my graduate seminar, so it's all very fresh in my mind. As you can maybe, I don't know, it's like I probably wouldn't have been able to put it that way if you had asked me when I was teaching something completely different. But there it is.
Oh, awesome. So, what about someone who thinks that I don't know, take some religious view according to which death isn't really final. In a sense, we survive it, perhaps live for eternity in some other realm. What would that sort of view have? What sort of would be the relevance of that, I guess, or how would we apply?
Right, so there's two different things that they're related to say about that. One is methodologically, Heidegger is not really trying to make a case for the mortality of the soul or anything like that. He's not really trying to argue with somebody who wants to insist there's something like life after death. It sounds pretty finitist when I put it that way, and I think it is. But here's what Heidegger thinks, I think. Heidegger thinks if you think there's life after death, you have to be clear about what death is first. Otherwise, your claim won't even be intelligible. This is another case in which, again, this is vindicating the idea that you have to get the phenomenology right. So before we even start talking about whether there's anything like life after death, we have to agree what we're talking about when we talk about death. And so Heidegger's claim is it's this. So what he's really doing is maybe posing a challenge to somebody who believes in some kind of immortality. If you believe in the immortality of the soul, you have to make good on the idea that you've got a soul in addition to your body. So good luck with that. You might, fine. But we have to, if you think there's life after death, we have to agree about what we mean by death. And this is a phenomenology of my experience of my own death. I obviously don't experience it like an outside observer. I can't be at my own funeral, but I have the experience everybody has of facing their mortality. And I think the reason he's right about this is because this is the only thing that can explain why people have such an investment in believing in something like a life after death, precisely because it has the kind of fundamental anxiety character that Heidegger's describing. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be a very motivated sort of belief. So, yeah, you can have that belief if you want it, but you have to earn it by being honest about what you think it's life after, right? So I think, it's a separate kind of argument to have about whether there's any reason to believe in life after death. And Heidegger isn't really even entertaining any of those arguments. And I'm sure he thought something even stronger, which is that what he said is more or less that other question completely out of business. But you don't have to believe that. Like I say, just off the top of my head, you'd either have to draw a very sharp distinction between the soul and the body, or, well, what else? I mean, that's a minimal condition, but that's a big one already. But you'd have to tell us about what it is you're asserting or what it is you believe when you believe that. But Heidegger's not telling you can't believe it. He's absolutely not trying to see, because he's not doing that kind of metaphysics, right? I mean, he's doing this kind of phenomenology, which is going to help us see what sorts of metaphysical questions are possible or intelligible or even worth sort of thinking about. The problem with a lot of that metaphysics, like, for example, about the immortality of the soul, is it's so disconnected from phenomenology, from our actual experience of ourselves and our relation to our deaths, that it can easily become a kind of merely scholastic exercise.
But
that's my little editorial sort of comment on that. But sorry, what?
Well, it would be relevant, though, in the sense that, whether our lives are ultimately finite or not, makes a difference to, or at least should make a difference to how we live our lives now, or how we think about our lives.
Oh, sure. Oh, I'm not saying that question doesn't itself have its own implications. Of course. But what I think Heidegger is saying is, look, if you want to believe in a kind of infinitude or immortality, you have to at least admit that what that's supposed to be a remedy for, or what it provides hope for against, is the experience you already have of your life as finite because of death. If you want to say, but it's also true that it's infinite because it extends beyond death, that's fine. But what you have to admit is that the phenomenon, the experience of being a human being, now, I'm not saying he's got a knockdown argument for this, but the claim is, you know that your life, your bodily, earthly existence is finite because you experience it in just this way, with anxiety, anticipating the loss of everything and the closing down of your possibilities. If that's not already part of the phenomenology you can concede, then we can hardly even start talking about life after death, because we don't even have a concept of death.
Fair enough. So we had another text question from XO Faroka concerning Heidegger's views on technology. I guess it's a big question, but what is it that Heidegger disliked about modern technology, and how is it that it chains us and keeps us unfree, as he says?
Good. Well, so the first distinction to draw is between technology, again, as we ordinarily understand the term, which refers to technological things, instruments, technologies like the computer, and that's what we often mean by technology. We mean the instruments or the tools that are these amazing things we make use of. And that's not exactly what he's talking about. And he doesn't really dislike those. But he says there is what he calls a technological understanding of being. So this is, again, very different from the understanding of being that was alive in the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, the Roman or Greek antiquity. This is a very new, modern thing. And the technological understanding of being is an understanding of everything as a kind of resource material to exploit and manipulate and use efficiently as possible. That's what he doesn't like. I say he doesn't like it, but that's maybe a little too strong. I mean, well, he does sort of not like it, but let me say, try to say why. So Heidegger is not what you might call a Luddite. He doesn't think we should smash our iPhones and go back to writing with quill pens and so on. He watched the soccer game on TV like a lot of other people, and he was very sort of rural and conservative and old-fashioned and nostalgic, maybe in a lot of ways. But what his criticism is aimed at is not the tools, but you can call it mentality, but his term is understanding of being, that everything is resource material, not just the physical resources of nature, but us too. Everything is to be made use of efficiently. It's like the Marines, be all you can be, right? And we're always trying to be maximally efficient. And we keep track of our pulse and the steps we take with our iPhone, and we count calories, and we count hours in the day. And we want to make use of everything in this maximally efficient, optimizing sort of way. That whole phenomenon, that whole world, that way of life is what he calls technology. Now, why doesn't he like it? It's not that he just thinks it's bad for us and it'll have terrible consequences and it's unhealthy or whatever. He thinks that it is its tendency is to cover up. How do I put this? It covers up all the different ways that things can possibly reveal themselves and manifest themselves. So it's the exact opposite of what I was talking about a minute ago when I was talking about a thing or an artwork, which pulls together a world and allows things to be the things they are. So the Heidelberg Bridge allows the banks of the river to be banks, and it makes the river, and it lets the birds flying over the bridge be the birds they are, because you can see the sort of harmony between the arches of the bridge and the way the birds fly. There's a particular bird that flies like this. It flaps its wings and then it tucks them in, and then it kind of flies in a kind of arc. And Hölderlin was comparing that to the arches in the bridge. So the bridge is letting the birds be the birds, and it's letting the sky be the sky, and the artwork is doing that too. Technology doesn't do that at all. The hydroelectric plant on the Rhine, Heidegger says, is just there. You don't notice it. It blends in with everything, and everything just looks like resource material. So it's not that it's wrong and bad and has bad consequences. It's that it flattens everything out and keeps things from showing up as the various things they are. It makes everything into styrofoam, right, or balsa wood, just stuff to be used, or information. The information age, everything is just information. And you'll hear people say this, they mean it literally, like they think everything really just is information. That's the fundamental, metaphysically basic stuff. Completely malleable, completely flexible, and maximally efficient, right? So I think he thinks it impoverishes our world. And that's what's bad about it. It's not that we're going to poison nature and destroy ourselves. It's that it makes everything flat and monodimensional and doesn't allow what we were calling before, what he called this gathering, sheltering, opening up of a world. So I think he thinks it generates this sense of homelessness and not being rooted in a world, this uprootedness, lostness of modernity. That's I think that what's bad about it.
But do you not think that there are at least some cases where that's not true of technology? I mean, there's
like,
I don't know, like take something, like take the Hoover Dam. I don't know. I think there's something nice about it. It's something that might tie things together in that way. I mean,
kind of awesome and maybe sublime even. The spectacle of that. Maybe. So here's what I think. If you can come up with an example like that, I think we can come up with other examples. Then what I would certainly concede, and what Heidegger would concede, is that, of course, it's compatible that be a technological thing, very efficient tool or instrument, and that it be doing something like a thing does in his sense. It could. But that's a compatibility between technology, like I said, in the ordinary sense of the tool or the instrument, with this other kind of understanding of being. But again, it's the technological understanding of being that he doesn't like, not the particular technologically sophisticated things we've managed to make. If the Hoover Dam, I see, and you want to say the Hoover Dam as such, like in its capacity as being just efficient. And but see, I think if I understood the spirit of the example, it's that it's more than that. It sort of is quite a visual spectacle to behold, right?
Yeah.
So
maybe it's definitely not just its like technological efficiency or what it's used for.
The hydroelectric plant on the Rhine, really, you drive past it and you didn't even notice it. That's the kind of the spirit of that example. But here's something that's visibly conspicuous. But here, I guess, what do I want to say about that? I would still say we have to think more about what's impressive about it. You might think that what's impressive about it is just the massive amounts of water flowing over it and generating energy. If it's just the massiveness, the spectacle of enormity and power, that might have an aesthetic effect on you. You might have this ooh-ah experience looking at it. But I think, so I'm going to slightly take back what I said a minute ago. In this case, I don't think that's giving you a sense of sheltering and gathering. I think that's a kind of almost frightening, awesome sort of view of the power of our capacity to make things massively efficient, right? I think it is a visible spectacle, but it's a spectacle. What is it a spectacle of? It's a spectacle of the sheer enormity and power and forcefulness of our devices. And if the point of that is that, look how technologically organized and efficient the world has become, then I think Heidegger would say that's frightening. No, I don't actually, in that particular case, I don't think it's maybe not the quite right example, because So notice that Heidegger, when I say he's contrasting this with a work of art, it's very important to see that Heidegger doesn't think of works of art in terms of aesthetic experience. And you can have an aesthetic experience of the Hoover Dam, but that doesn't tell us that it's a work of art or anything like it. It doesn't tell you even that it's a thing gathering anything. I'd like to know what's around the Hoover Dam. I don't remember it. I think I might have been there. I was at the Grand Coulee Dam once. I don't know if I've ever seen the Hoover Dam. But I remember my experience of the Grand Coulee Dam was that what was around it was nothing in particular. It was a desert and highway, and you didn't really know you were there until you were there, and then boom, and it's pretty impressive to see. But it's not really pulling together a world or a culture or showing people what their identity is or doing what maybe the Brooklyn Bridge or Central Park or the Eiffel Tower or the Notre Dame. Those are things doing gathering and sheltering and truth happening. I don't know about the dam, to be honest. But look, here's a different case in which the thing is very technological, but it's doing something very untechnological. I think of televisions and computers where you can tune in and look at documentaries about octopuses and whales and galaxies and all kinds of art and all kinds of things that are just mind-blowing and spectacular and wonderful and don't have any connection with a technological understanding of being, but you've got that experience only thanks to a very high-resolution computer monitor or high-definition TV, which is perfectly technological. So that's perfectly compatible. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.
But then it's not the thing. It's not the thing that's really like the center. That really is just an instrument for having a different kind of experience.
It's what it's like representing to you or conveying to you.
And I think so. And I guess the point of my example was so you could still also kind of be in awe of the technology that's letting this happen. Like here it is in my own little living room. I'm looking at these whales swimming around the ocean, and I don't know if you saw the recent film about the octopuses. What was it called? Friend the Octopus or something like that. Which is quite stunning. It's really stunning. And this guy studied this octopus and, had a kind of personal rapport with this octopus for almost the whole lifespan. It's, span of its life, which was maybe a year, and filmed it or videoed it for over a long period and got to know it. And it's really extraordinary stuff. And yeah, you can be in awe of the way your monitor, your TV or computer brings that right into your room. That can be a kind of wonderful experience. Yeah. So again, it's not the things that's the center of his critique or the target of his critique. It's the mentality or the understanding that everything is resource material to be exploited efficiently. And notice that with a story about the octopus, what you're seeing is a underwater ecosystem and a world and environment and an octopus, and none of that is understood technologically. This isn't just stuff we can exploit and organize efficiently. This is a strange world of these wonderful, marvelous alien creatures underwater, and that's the idea. That's not technological at all.
Great. These are the sort of things that we could talk about for hours, I suppose. But given we've been going for about an hour and 3/4 now, we're probably going to wrap it up shortly. I think I'll just say that again, thank you so much for coming and taking it part and spending the time to answer all of our questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been really enjoyable.